All right, so today we're diving into a paper that makes a really bold claim that a foundational idea in American law has been completely turned on its head. We're going to trace how the thinking shifted from justice being something you discover to something you create. Let's get into it.
So this whole paper really boils down to one simple but pretty huge question. If enough of us agree that something is right, does that actually make it right? That's the core tension we're going to unpack. This clash between what's popular and what might be, objectively true.
Okay, to really get what this paper is arguing, you have to understand this one key difference it lays out. On one hand, you have legitimacy. That's the idea that a government has the right to rule because we the people agree to it, consent. But on the other hand, you have justice, the idea of what's truly morally right. The paper says the founders saw these as totally separate things. Legitimacy comes from the people, but justice, that comes from somewhere higher.
All right, let's start at the beginning with what the paper calls the original blueprint. This is the idea that justice isn't something humans invent. It's something we find through reason.
Now, this whole idea is built on a concept called natural law. The paper points to thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, arguing that the founders believed certain moral truths are just part of the universe, kind of like gravity. They aren't based on opinions, and they're not up for a vote. They're just there, and anyone can figure them out using reason. And in this view, our laws are only legit if they line up with that higher, natural law.
And check out this quote from James Madison. It just nails this idea. He says, "Religious freedom is an unalienable right." So what does that really mean? It means the right was there before any government was ever created. The government's job isn't to grant you that right, it's to recognize and protect a right you already have. Your consent can create a government, sure, but it can't create or take away a natural right.
But, things change. The paper argues that pretty soon, this original foundation started to get some cracks. The whole philosophical ground started to shift, away from universal reason and more towards power and will.
So the paper kind of takes us on this intellectual road trip through a few key thinkers. We start way back with Aquinas and his whole reason-based system. Then, we see these small but really important shifts with guys like Pufendorf and Blackstone. And according to the paper, these little changes are what open the door for a massive one with Rousseau, who we'll get to in a minute.
And here's where things get really interesting, because it's a subtle shift that the paper highlights. For Aquinas, a law was a law because it was rational, it was logical, it was good. But for Pufendorf, the authority changed. A law was binding simply because God willed it to be so. See the difference? It's a move from reason to will. And if law is just based on will, the next logical question is, whose will?
Next, we get to William Blackstone, who is a huge influence on the American founders. But the paper points out this major contradiction in his work. On the one hand, he says no human law can be valid if it goes against natural law, but then he also says that Parliament's power is absolute. Well, which is it? You can't really have it both ways. The paper argues that later on, people basically resolved this conflict by just dropping the whole natural law part.
Okay, so this is where the paper argues the whole thing gets flipped completely upside down. The original blueprint gets tossed out.
The key figure here, according to the paper, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And listen to this quote. It is an absolute game changer. He's saying that morality doesn't even exist before society. It's the social contract, the general will of the people that creates right and wrong. This is the big pivot point. Justice is no longer something you discover. It's something the collective builds. And that's a 180-degree turn from the natural law tradition.
And this new way of thinking gets a name in the paper: constructivism. It's literally the polar opposite of natural law. In this worldview, there's no pre-existing moral truth out there. Instead, things like our rights, our ideas of justice, they're all just social constructs. We made them up. And because we made them, well, we can change them.
So you might be asking, how does a change this big happen kind of under the radar? Well, the paper uses this German philosophical term Aufheben to explain it. You can think of it like an ideological Trojan horse. You keep all the familiar words, like liberty or equality, but you secretly swap out their original meaning for a totally new one. The box looks the same, but the stuff inside is completely different.
Phew, okay, so that was a lot of philosophy. Let's get practical. Let's look at how the paper argues this huge philosophical flip has actually played out in American law. And it uses the First Amendment as its main case study.
The analysis here breaks this whole transformation down into 3 main steps. First, there was a definitional change. The paper argues the word religion, which it says originally just meant different Christian groups within a broadly Christian society, got redefined to mean that Christianity itself was just one of many different equal sects. Second, a structural change. A rule that was meant to limit only Congress suddenly got applied to every level of government. And third, new legal rules were invented from whole cloth to enforce this new meaning.
And this quote right here from Justice Hugo Black is flagged as a pivotal moment. The paper makes a big deal of the fact that the phrase wall of separation is nowhere in the Constitution. It's actually from a private letter Thomas Jefferson wrote. But in this 1947 Supreme Court case, that metaphor was suddenly treated like it was constitutional law. And that, the paper claims, changed the game for religion and government in America.
So this new wall got its legal muscle from something called the Lemon Test. It was a standard that, according to the paper, was used for decades to systematically push religious expression out of the public square. Now, even though the Supreme Court officially ditched the Lemon Test back in 2022, the paper's point is that you can't just undo 50 years of its influence on policies, legal advice, and just general culture overnight. The effects linger.
All right, so let's get to the bottom line here. What's the big takeaway? Why does the paper say this philosophical flip, this inversion from discovered justice to created justice, matters so much right now?
And the paper's conclusions are, well, they're pretty stark. It claims this inversion leads to 3 huge consequences. First, it says a society can just get stuck. It loses the ability to even reason about what's actually good for itself. Second, education changes. It's no longer about passing down truth, but about shaping minds to make sure people give the right kind of consent. And third, the purpose of surveillance can shift from stopping actual harm to policing thoughts that don't fit the approved narrative.
So in the end, the paper's main argument is this: just using the founders' words isn't going to cut it. To really restore the original constitutional system, it claims, you have to restore the philosophical ground it was built on. And that is the idea that there's a real, objective, moral truth out there that we can discover through reason, a truth that's bigger than any government or public opinion poll.
And that leaves us right back where we started, with the core question of this whole analysis. Is justice something timeless that we find, like a law of nature? Or is it something we invent, something we build and rebuild together? According to this paper, how you answer that one question changes absolutely everything.